because this morning during the inaugural session, Honorable Prime Minister of India also highlighted the importance of this theme or this aspect. He highlighted how it is necessary to make infrastructure disaster resilient. Some of the important observations he made this morning are that all development projects, particularly infrastructure such as airports, roads, hospitals, schools, bridges, etc., should be built to appropriate standards and contribute to resilience of communities they seek to serve. Second, all our public expenditure must be risk informed in the sense that when we take up a project, we must see its impact or implications for disaster risk. Because it is seen that in some cases, even the development project can increase vulnerability if not properly designed. Third, there is a need to generate new knowledge for hazard assessment, disaster resilient technology, and mechanism for encouraging reduction in infrastructure risk, and also the role of financing in achieving this. With this background, the theme of the session has become much more relevant. Before we designed the particular features event or session, we were thinking that we will focus on three aspects. Firstly, why to discuss disaster resilient infrastructure or the rationale for the theme. Second, what are the challenges for making infrastructure disaster resilient? And finally, what can be some of the points for intervention or how to go about it or the way forward? With the inaugural session and the focus on this particular aspect, the first aspect, that is, why do we need to make infrastructure disaster resilient, has become somewhat less relevant because we need to make it disaster resilient. So we may focus on the other two. Having said that, I would like to still point out some of the facts. As we know that all these three agreements, which was again mentioned this morning, the Sustainable Development Goal, the Sendai Framework, and the Paris Agreement of Climate Change, all these focus on how to reduce risk, particularly in the context of new investment, new development project and infrastructure. And as all of us know that for economic growth we need to build infrastructure, and many studies show that there is a huge gap in our infrastructure in Asia Pacific region and other developing countries. In fact, it is said that the infrastructure gap is to the extent of several $1 trillion, and often these projects will be taken up in the coming years by the multilateral financing institutions and other such institutions, apart from, of course, public investment. So it is necessary to have responsible and risk-sensitive infrastructure. And as we know, at the time of natural hazard, the impact becomes much more severe because of damage to infrastructure like roads, hospitals. We have seen in some of the past disasters how district hospitals, large hospitals also totally collapse, not only killing patients and collapses, some multi-storied building collapses. So all these raise very important question about our design standards and our capability. So there is no doubt that we need to make all infrastructure disaster resilient. But how to make it, that is a very important question. There are many challenges, of course. Very often it is said that we do not have the standards to be adopted, but it is now well known that many countries, including India and others in the Asian and Pacific region, they have very good standards. But in spite of that, we are not able to build the infrastructure and other structure to the standard because they are not enforced or not enforceable. Even if it can be enforced, the capacity to adopt those standards, because the engineer who actually designs may not be able to apply the standards, may not have that knowledge. There are knowledge gaps also. Even if the design is proper, the engineers and others who actually implement it on the ground, their capability also becomes extremely important. So issues like financing, assessing risk, design, execution and maintenance are extremely important. Another aspect is that we know all these things. We know that we need to adopt certain standards. We know that we need to enforce. We know that we have to build structures to standards, but still we are not able to do. Is there a disincentive to do it? Some people argue that it will be more expensive. Some others say that it will not be as expensive as one can imagine. So how to go about it in the future, the way forward? This morning the Prime Minister suggested some mechanism like some center, some coalition and so on. So these are some of the aspects we need to discuss. We have today on the panel a very distinguished panel, and most of them are of course from the multilateral financial institutions. The idea is that whether financing of project can play a role apart from providing fund, whether it can play a role in incentivizing the project promoters or those who are taking up the project or those who are availing financing to adopt those standards to make the project disaster resilient, because the financing institutions can play an important role while financing the project if they can stipulate that it should be disaster resistant. And even if it involves certain additional cost, it can be built into the financing mechanism. That is one area. But apart from that, of course, there are many other areas of capacity building, areas of sharing knowledge. But with all these things, we also need to look at the of course, we have only 1.5 hours. It's a very vast subject. Many things can be discussed. But I would suggest that our focus should be what are the crucial areas, how to address some of the constraints which are well known, what role the financing institutions can play. And since it is the regional conference, we did not focus too much on any country specific studies or example. Whether we can, after an hour of discussion, come out with some suggestion which will help us devising a mechanism for cooperation among various countries in developing new knowledge, in applying the existing knowledge, and in trying to ensure that it is applied effectively. Because in 1.5 hours, if we can, it is not necessary to find all the solution in this session, but it will go a long way if we can crystallize some ideas about how to go about in finding solutions from time to time during the next few years. As I mentioned, we have a very eminent group of panelists. To my left, Mrs. Arundhati Bhattacharya. She is chairperson and managing director of the State Bank of India, the largest bank in the country. which can play a very important role in infrastructure financing. To my right, Dr. Robert Glasser. He is heading the United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Risk Reduction, which coordinates the entire disaster management activities of the United Nations. He is also the special representative to the UN Secretary General. Then we have Mr. D.J. Pandian. He is now in the AIIB, which is a new financial institution, and he is based in Beijing. And this new multilateral international financing institution is going to play a very, very important role in financing new projects. Then we have from the Asian Development Bank, Mr. Wenchai Jhag. He is the Vice President of the Vice President Operation. He is also a very important player in financing important project. And Asian Development Bank, as you know, has played a very important role during the last many years, and his experience and knowledge will be extremely important. Then we have with us Mr. Wenchai Xian from the New Development Banks, which is known as the BRICS Bank, which was set up recently. Finally, we have Mr. Ahmed from the World Bank, and he is the country director of the World Bank. And World Bank also has played an important role, as you know. And all these, whether it is World Bank, ADB, and the other two international banks, and of course the SBI, they not only will play an important role in financing, but also bringing out about new knowledge, encouraging and incentivizing mechanisms for exchange of new ideas, because that also they can play. So with these distinguished panelists, I hope that we'll have a very fruitful event, and each panelist will give their introductory comments for about 7 to 8 minutes or maximum 10 minutes. Then we'll have about half an hour for discussion. Then we will conclude the session. May I first request I'll request Mr. Jhang, who is from the Asian Development Bank, to make his presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I'm so pleased to join such important panel for this very this features event on the disaster risk resilient infrastructure for sustainable development. And I have a written statement, but to save time, I will try to pick up some of the important message. I will not read my statement, but as we all know, global infrastructure investment needs over the next 15 years are substantial. I got a figure here. We have $90 trillion according to the 2016 New Climate Economy report. And also many people in the world are still without access to the electricity, drinking water, safe drinking water, and basic sanitations. Clear infrastructure challenges are enormous. They are even more alarming if we take disaster risk into account. Disaster losses in ADB's developing member countries have been rising in line with the GDP growth over the past 5 decades. Over the past 10 years alone, direct physical losses have averaged $46 billion per annum. The failure of the infrastructure has also contributed to 337,000 fatalities over the same period. And moreover, expanding economic connectivity is increasing systemic risk with disaster damage in one sector or country, affecting production and delivery of services and reducing GDP elsewhere. And however, the disaster losses are by no means inevitable. There's a vast area of actions we can take to strengthen resilience. ADB has been involved in a project to reduce the disaster risk virtually since its inception. We are putting plans in place to ensure that disaster and climate risk are prioritized in the investor project. In September 2015, ADB announced it will double our annual climate financing from the ADB's own resources to $6 billion by 2020. And a third of this, $2 billion, will be for the climate change adaptation. $4 billion will for the climate change mitigations. Earlier this year, ADB donors also agreed to provide up to $200 million in grant over the period of 2017 to 2020 for ADB's poorest and most debt distressed countries, specifically for disaster risk reduction. ADB will provide up to additional $224 million in concessional loan for this purpose. Our experience over the past 50 years, like Chairman said, together with that of others, has highlighted a number of good practices that will help guide our effort to strengthen disaster resilience. I just want to highlight some of the 8 actions we can take in the future. First, I think we need to strengthen knowledge and understanding of disaster risk, ensuring that there's a robust, high-resolution geospatial data readily available to all stakeholders. Disaster risk information has regional public goods aspect, and there's a clear role for multilateral development banks and regional organizations as well as the government in this area. For example, ADB is currently processing a new $200 million disaster risk management program for Pakistan, which will include extensive risk modeling at the national level, 20 city and district multi-hazard vulnerability and risk assessment, and 50 community risk assessment. Second, we must take account of disaster risk in the design and location of all the infrastructure. ADB is currently expanding its mandatory project climate risk screening tools to ensure that disaster risk considerations, including geophysical risk, are systematically assessed and addressed as appropriate in all ADB projects. Third, we must recognize the dynamic, constantly evolving nature of disaster risk. Climate change is expected to change the frequency and the intensity of natural hazard. Exposure and vulnerability to natural disasters are also constantly changing as economy and population grow. Disaster resilience solution must therefore be forward-looking and flexible, taking account future disaster risk and allowing scope for adjustment to continually delivering result. For example, increasing flooding risk was identified as a major concern in designing a $95 million rural road improvement project in the Tonle Sap Basin, Cambodia. To address both current and future flood risk, the project therefore includes the elevation of the road segment, the use of highly absorptive subgrade materials, planting of trees and grass on the embankment, the development of flood early warning system, and the government capacity development. Fourth, we must undertake urgent upstream work to ensure that land use plans take account of disaster risk, that there are appropriate building codes in place, and those building codes are enforced, that national technical design standards for roads, schools, and so forth take account of disaster risk, and that local builders and the craftsmen have the capacity to apply the buildings codes and standards correctly. For example, ADB is supporting 22 towns in Bangladesh to develop climate resilient integrated master plans. Fifth, we must strengthen knowledge and understanding of the benefits of disaster resilience and overcome misperception that disaster risk is necessarily costly. For example, earthquake resilient features add only 4 to 8% to the cost of school construction in Nepal. Retrofitting is far more expensive. in order of over 30% of cost of a new building, school building in Nepal. However, retrofittings also reap significant benefit in terms of the averted loss of life. These benefits were demonstrated when all of the 160 schools systematically retrofitted and the ADB component of the multi-donor school sector program in Nepal survived in the 2015 earthquake. Available data suggests more broadly that disaster risk reduction measures have average net benefit to cost ratio in order of 4 to 1, and far higher ratios in some areas. 6, we needed to take advantage of revolution in technology, applying new solutions to old problems, identifying low-cost solutions. For example, ADB is utilizing Earth observation-related technology in landslide risk assessment to inform the design urban project in Armenia, and in flood risk assessment to support the design of the transport project in Timor-Leste. 7th, we needed to recognize disaster risk cannot be entirely eliminated. We needed to strengthen preparedness for future events, for instance, through the establishment of early warning system, and by building redundancies in the critical infrastructure. Financial preparedness is also important as well to speed up early recovery and reconstruction, limiting the indirect social and economic consequences of direct damage, enable the now widely recognized need to build back better and spread the cost of disaster response efforts over time. For instance, through the greater use of insurance instruments, ADB is placing increasing efforts on the financial preparedness. For instance, through developing disaster insurance options for cities in the Philippines and via contingent credit line. Finally, we needed to act together. The Premier Moody or His Excellency also highlight the regional and international cooperation this morning. The Sustainable Development Goals and the Sandy Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction set up ambitious intention for disaster resilience, rightly so given the scale of the need. To achieve them, however, we need to coordinate our efforts in very closely working in partnership across government, development partner, private sector, and the individual communities to leverage the potential complementarities and synergy to ensure that there's no key unmet needs, learn from each other, and ultimately to maximize our collective achievement to halt and ultimately reverse the current trend of increasing disaster risks and losses. In this regard, ADB welcomed the proposed establishment of the Coalition for Disaster Resilience Infrastructure and looks forward to working with all of you and as we strive towards a more resilient future. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Wensai Jhan, for very important suggestions. And you have rightly said that we need appropriate building standards and how to enforce, and also mentioned that the cost of disaster-resistant construction is not as expensive. I think 8 to 10% you said more. Of course, retrofitting can be more expensive. But anyway, these are very, very important aspects. Our next speaker is Mrs. Arundhati Bhattacharya.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon. I think just now the 8 points that were given were more or less very comprehensive in regarding this particular subject of disaster risk reduction. So what I'll do is I'll break up my remarks into two slots. The first is regarding the projects that we as a bank finance, and we have done quite a large amount of infrastructure financing, especially in India. And the second is regarding the banking system itself and what it should do in order to reduce its risk in the face of any of these disasters. So in respect of the first piece, which is to do with financing, I think one thing that was said is that very often we find that when we are given the projects that we are to finance, that the area of disaster risk reduction is not really addressed in any kind of granularity. It is something that is touched upon, but really not gone into in any depth. One of the reasons for that, of course, is that people are still looking at bringing the costs in as low as possible, especially if it is a bid out project, a project that has been bid out by the government or any large organization. You are going to be judged on the amount that you are going to charge for the project. And if it is not mandatory that you have certain disaster risk reduction measures in place, and if putting those measures in is going to increase your prices, then there is no incentive whatsoever in putting those things in. So basically, I think, you have to start at the beginning. At the very beginning, where if it is a government bid out project, what are the priorities that you are putting in? What are the necessary things that you need in a project? If you are able to delineate that very well, then obviously the people who will be bidding for it will perforce have to ensure that all of that is in, and therefore you will get bids that are apples to apples and not apples to oranges, and obviously then you will be able to get these features into the project itself. In respect of individual projects like buildings and things of that nature, we have found actually the way to bring these in is to create better knowledge and awareness amongst the users. For instance, about 4 or 5 years back, if you asked for green buildings, there would be very few. And the reason again was that green buildings normally cost a little more. And again, the people who would buy those apartments were not too sure why they were paying a slightly higher price. But as knowledge grows and they realize that getting into green buildings is actually going to benefit them, we have found that more and more of the promoters are coming in with green buildings. And we have tried to incentivize from our side by saying that if you're actually going to do a green building, we will finance it at slightly lower prices. So there is an incentive, and on the other side, there is an acceptance of the slightly higher cost. So I think both of these two things, that on the one side, you must mandate certain things so that it gets taken in, and on the other side, from the user's side, you create the awareness that you have to pay a little more, but as a result, you're going to benefit in these ways. I think if these two things move hand in hand, then definitely that is something that will enable better creation of infrastructure. I think India is in a very good position where this is concerned, because we are still at the initial phases of our infra build. There is a huge amount of infra that is still to come into India. And if there is anything that India needs to do, it is to ensure that these DRR norms are now quickly put into place. Also, I think for financing institution like ours, we need to be able to tap into the huge knowledge bank that many of our multilateral banks have in order to understand how we need to assess whatever is being put in as the DRR reduction or the disaster risk reduction measures, to understand whether these are the right measures. For instance, again, India is going in a very big way into renewable energy. We again, as a bank, are new to financing renewable energy. But what we have done, therefore, is we have sent our team across to many of these multilateral agencies. We have sent our team to World Bank, to ADB, to KfW, because they have already financed renewable in many countries. They know the downsides. They know what is required to be done. And we are trying to get the knowledge from them in order to ensure that as we go into a new area of financing, we don't make mistakes. So therefore, there has to be a proper forum for exchange of experiences, for exchange of knowledge, and empowering of the new players that will come into this area, so as to ensure that we know exactly what we are doing and we are able to do it well. The other thing I also find, at least this is my experience again in India, is that it is not only a question of putting in the right kind of measures at the initial stage, but also, should a disaster occur, how do you take care of it? And a very simple example I will give you. For instance, we have a power plant in Andhra which was hit by the cyclone Hudhud. Now that happened 2.5 years ago. We still haven't been able to get the insurance claim for it. Now that is not something that is very disaster friendly, in the sense that that particular unit has already made some investments. The interest meter of that investment is keeping on ticking. And we haven't been able to get any claim for the disaster, and therefore that unit we are still not able to put on the ground. So ultimately what is happening is some very costly resource is actually over a period of time becoming unviable. So obviously, you know, even for those who are mitigating disaster, people like those in the insurance agencies and insurance companies, they need to have the right kind of framework to be able to respond to disaster as quickly as possible. So I think, you know, if we get these things right as to how to increase knowledge, how to put in the right norms, how to incentivize, and on the other side maybe also disincentivize non-adoption of these measures, and thereafter ensure that the organizations that look at these areas are properly empowered. If we are able to do this, then definitely we'll make a very good beginning. From the banking side, if I can give you one or two very quick examples. For instance, when there was the flood in Srinagar, we found that the entire Srinagar was flooded and all of the currency chests of the banks were on the ground floor. Most of them were flooded, so there was actually no currency available. Now, very luckily, our Srinagar branch, the currency chest was on the first floor, which is very rare. Currency chest, because of the weight of it, is normally on the ground floor. Our currency chest was on the first floor, so we had currency that could be given. But how do I disburse it? Because all of the ATMs had become non-functional because they were underwater. Actually, we had 7 mobile ATMs airlifted by the army from Delhi into Srinagar, and with that we started dispensing cash all around. And that went a long way in mitigating people's difficulties, because while things were available, no money was available to buy it. So it was something that was very important to do. Similarly, in the Chennai floods, what we did was our people actually went around with handheld POS in canoes, from doorstep to doorstep, disbursing money. Because by then we had an offline model that could be used for actually connecting into your bank server bank accounts, and we had the POS through which we could swipe the cards and connect up to their accounts, find out how much money they had, and we could disburse cash. Now, all of these things have taught us a number of things. One, of course, is the fact that today the banking world is totally interconnected, totally real time. If connectivity fails, you have a big problem. So what you need to do is you need to have VSATs in some place or the other that can restore your connectivity as quickly as possible. Second, you need to be able to do banking on an offline mode. So you need to have stores of information at various places which could be pulled locally and banking could still be done. Similarly, in respect of the Nepal earthquake, we found that there were a lot of people who were wanting to cross into India because conditions in Nepal were very, very difficult. And they didn't know how to get the foreign currency, and we actually set up a large number of camps across the border in order to help people to get the foreign currency to cross over into India. Now, there again, the lessons were that you need to have the right kind of nimbleness in order to be able to respond to whatever scenario is emanating. And actually speaking, in every disaster, the scenario will be different. However, there are definitely lessons to be learned from these scenarios, and accordingly, the entire system needs to get prepared. But even today, we don't really have a body that collects these perceived wisdom or these experiences, and thereafter comes up with codes as to what the banking system needs to do in order to ensure that it can restore whatever order is required as quickly as possible. So possibly this is also something that needs to be done over a period of time. Maybe the banking regulator itself can look at all of these areas and find out that where finance is required, what is the way that we can look at disasters, and what is the preparedness, what is the kind of redundancies we need to have and we need to build in order to get people back on their feet as quickly as possible. Having said this, as I said, the first 8 points that were given were really very comprehensive. I think if we proceed on those lines and especially add in a fact of collaboration and creation of certain platforms that will look at these areas, I think definitely we have a chance of doing a very good job. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Bhattacharya, for extremely important suggestions which you have made, like mandating what should be the objective or what exactly is the requirement in a particular project, like it should be disaster resistant, making it very clear even before inviting bids or initiating the project. Then of course providing incentive in the different forms, because like he gave the example of green building. Then of course disincentive for non-compliance, and finally the role of collaboration. All these will enable us to come out with our recommendations of this particular session. Then I will request Dr. D.J. Pandian, Vice President and Chief Investment Officer of the Asian Infrastructure Bank.
Thank you, Chairman, distinguished panelists, friends. Of all the bankers present here, I am the youngest, not by age. I mean, AIIB, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, is less than 1 year old. World Bank is 70 years old. ADB is celebrating its 50th year. And State Bank, I do not know if you calculate the Imperial Bank's age, it is 100 years. And United Nations, we all know, it started in the 40s. We are 70 years old. Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank was started in January 2016, yet to complete the first year. So I have to learn a lot from all these senior bankers. But I take 2 minutes to say a few words about the AIB. This is owned by 57 countries, out of which 20 are from outside Asia, 37 are from Asia. It's the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. But it is only in my bank the word infrastructure is added. Not in World Bank, not in ADB, not in State Bank, or NDB. Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. My main mandate is to develop infrastructure in the Asian countries and to provide regional connectivity. These are the two main mandates. And what are the priority areas? Energy, transport, including all transport, road, port, railways, airport, and then urban development. All three areas are prone to high risk of disaster. So it is our duty as a moral responsibility to see how the projects which we are going to finance are resilient, are covered against the risk of disaster. I have seen in my limited experience in this MDB, number of projects coming to our board are for the management for discussion. Of course, we work very closely with the ADB and World Bank. A number of co-finance projects are going on because we want to be lean and green, so we want to step in their shoes to avoid any duplications. Thanks for their cooperation coordination. We were able to approve 6 projects and another 20 projects are on the pipeline. But I have never seen any of the project. The disaster risk is discussed elaborately. Yes, environmental risk is discussed. If I put this road and bridge, how many people will be rehabilitated, how many people will be displaced, how many trees you will cut, how many houses you will demolish, how this road will come, how we are going to help them, how it will affect the environment. That is being discussed, but not the disaster, which is impending to come in the days to come. It is invisible. Nobody is visualizing all these things. But we all know environment, climate change, and disaster are closely linked. So our project at the preparation stage itself should be sensitive to this disaster risk. Sometimes we all bankers are very good, investment bankers very good in disaster rehabilitation. After the disaster occurred, in relief and rehabilitation, we are good. Government administration is good. But now is the time to undertake some preventive steps. The $1 today we spend is equivalent to $100 which we are going to spend in the days to come. By spending $1 today, we can save hundreds and millions of dollars we can save by avoiding the loss in our economy. So the future of tomorrow's our children, depending upon how we conceive this project, how we identify this disaster risk, how we analyze this risk, What are the steps or tools we are providing to mitigate this risk? How we are internalizing the cost of these disaster risk into the main project cost? This is very important. So in the very beginning itself, we need to sensitize our staff, our project management, our directors, our stakeholders, that we need to step in at the beginning. Who will ensure? Even to educate the multilateral development banks, which are considered to be the knowledge banks, some agency is needed to point out technically, these are the areas, these are the locations, these are the risks. When you prepare the plan or project, please ensure these risks are addressed properly by your staff or by your management. Here we need a collaboration. Here we need a cooperation. Here we need a central agency to coordinate with all the banks. I am very happy, very proud to say that ADB has prepared a very nice report about the risk assessment in Bangladesh. We all know Bangladesh is known for very heavy risk of disaster. All the years it will get cyclone, and every year it will get flood after flood, and every year thousands and thousands of people will die, but the country will go on. MDBs will go on. So ADB has done a wonderful job in putting their all the staff, all the brains together and prepared a report assessing the disaster risk in Bangladesh, district by district, and how it can be mitigated. Now, these kind of disaster risk analysis report is needed for every country. For country in Mongolia, country Sri Lanka, in Maldives, in Myanmar, in India, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh. In India, it is different. Every region is different. A coastal region is different. The risk in Gujarat is different from the risk in West Bengal. The risk in Himachal Pradesh and Uttarakhand are different. The risk in Kerala and Tamil Nadu is different. The risk in the cities of Mumbai is different. The risk in city of Bangalore is different. So how we are going to prepare our analytical report identifying all these risks? This is a challenge today. We need an agency. We need a central agency within Asia to identify, understand, mobilize resources, knowledge, finance, all these resources have to be mobilized, and a report has to be prepared, which will serve as a roadmap to prepare various projects of infrastructures. We are here, $90 trillion is needed in the next 15 years to bridge the infrastructure gap. If you have to spend $93 trillion, can't we spend $100 billion to create a center which is equipped with everything to assess the various environmental risks? I visited Mongolia, Ulaanbaatar. 50% of the country's population is living in the capital city. But a great amount of pollution, disaster can strike any day. Everybody will know it. But still we are not able to address that issue and prepare a proper plan to mitigate that. World Bank is there, ADB is there. I'm not criticizing, we are all there. But we need the political will of the country. Political will is very much essential. Today, various political leaders have come, and they are going to give this political declaration. This is very important. Multilateral development banks can come. Financial resources can be mobilized. NGOs can be mobilized. But political will is needed, because we can create various laws, regulations, policies, standards, codes. How it is going to be implemented, how it is going to be practiced, that is very important. Somebody should be there as a policeman to see these codes and regulations are properly implemented at the local level, at the municipality level, the regional level, at the national level. So that's why we need a coalition. I think this is why morning our Prime Minister has given this clarion call for a coalitions. I think if that comes through, I think AIB will support, subject to approval of various other conditions. We are here to convey that whatever the indicative action pointed out in the background paper is very, very important. We need to develop a technical knowledge. We need to leverage the knowledge and the experience gained by various countries like India, Indonesia, China, Japan, who have gained experience in mitigating the disaster risk and in identifying the disaster risk and carrying out the actions. 2001, Gujarat earthquake, everybody knows, tremendous damage, I think, when the world was shaken. But the government came together, World Bank came together, ADB opened his office in Gujarat. It is unprecedented in the history. Various relief agencies, NGOs came together, and the chairman who coordinated all the effort is sitting here as the chair. I think every day after day some policies were announced. Every week some government orders will come. But not just orders. To implement, there were agencies to give the input to make the policy, but there were agencies to implement it, and there were the administrative skill to see and the political will to see that these orders, these codes, these regulations, these policies are implemented properly and in a well-defined time. That is why disaster as a evil today is very afraid of striking Gujarat. It will take another 50 years for them to sow their head. So we need to take action and put it into practice to see that disaster is not going to touch us. It's like a preventive step, like an antibiotic which you take or we give it to our children so that their health is ensured. So to ensure the future of our children, to ensure the future of our ensuing community, we have to invest today in identifying these risks. Here the MDBs, the banks, the NGOs, the government all have to play a greater role, a coordinated role, and we hope that today's deliberation will help us to establish a world-class international center, maybe in India, maybe somewhere else, but a center should come in Asia to see that the future disasters are minimized. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pandian. You said that you are the youngest here, not even 1 year old, but probably when you spoke, everybody must have thought that you were the oldest. So, and with so much of confidence that we must take into account the disaster impact right from the project conceptualization or design stage, and of course the need for collaboration and starting a world-class center, and AIIB of course subject to other clearances will also participate. So these are all extremely important statements and which actually will set the tone for our recommendations. And two important things which have come out from his analysis, that we must incorporate the disaster impact at the design stage. And in fact, there are two aspects. One is that we must see that the structure, whether it is airport or road or whatever, is disaster resistant. It will not be vulnerable to, say, earthquake, cyclone and flood. But the other side is also true in the sense that some of the development projects increase disaster risk. The way they are constructed, the location, that can increase. If they are located in the flood-prone area, the risk, the vulnerability increases. So that also we have to see both sides. And I think this point comes from your what you presented. And finally, the collaboration aspect is also extremely important. Our next speaker is Mr. Xian Zhu. He is the president of the New Development Bank. He is also new, maybe he is slightly, I'm not sure, older than Mr. Pandian or not, so he can also. So let us see how they will compete. They are much younger than others and probably they will be much more dynamic, much more proactive and much more, they will have much more incentive and much more enthusiasm to go ahead much faster.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And we are very pleased to have this opportunity to participate in this very important conference and also have a chance to discuss on this increasingly important subject on the disaster and also its impact and how that we can be more resilient. As Chairman and also our AIB colleagues just mentioned, New Development Bank, or rather popularly known as a BRIC Bank, was also very new. We were established 1 year ago in Shanghai, so we just started our operations. And our major mandate is infrastructure and also sustainable development. This conference provides us a very good opportunity to think in our business supporting infrastructure, how to make them sustainable. Then I think one important factor is how that we can manage the infrastructure based on the disaster resilient features. To do that, I think that probably there will be different ways. But in our mind, probably we need to think even upstream when we prepare, we appraise the infrastructure projects. We need to build in the factors of natural disasters and make it the infrastructure in the future assets by the future generations, really that they can be the natural disasters resilient. And so I think important thing or the lessons through other MDBs or other agencies to us is how that we can embed and the disaster factors into the infrastructures rather than we put that separately, or rather when the disaster occur, we try to do all the things and try to manage afterwards. Because by human nature, whenever there's a major disaster occurs, neither at the national level or at the global level, that can catch a lot of public attentions, support, sympathies, and also a lot of contributions. But human memory can be short. Years later, people probably tend to forget. If really that we can prepare ourselves beforehand with all kinds of necessary measures, including some slightly additional cost of disaster mitigations, and then even in the areas of infrastructure, we will be much better off rather than to say whenever disasters occurred, whenever the destroying the infrastructure need to be rebuilt, rehabilitated, and then we start from there. I think that probably is a very important lesson to all of us, and then I think for my institution, which is new, and how that we can really embed and the infrastructure and development with this disaster factor. Second, I also want to share with some of the experiences personally I had and also working in other MDBs, such as World Bank. I think that one thing important, particularly in infrastructure development, is how that the governments as regulators can, from time to time, strengthen, upgrade the regulations, compliance, particularly in the areas of building codes, standards, and also it's a responsibility of the government, financiers, and others enforcing these, adequately regulated or upgraded standards of the code of constructions. For example, when I was in the World Bank, for one period of time, I worked on the Pacific Island countries, which are also hit and frequently by disasters. But you'll find that it's very fragile for the infrastructure there to stand any major disasters because I think that the code of construction was very weak. Secondly, little attention to the enforcement. So this is also very important lessons we need to learn on both sides, both in terms of the regulations to be adequate and also the focus on the enforcement and the compliance. Of course, as a financing institution, we probably all aware, not denying, that if really we want to make infrastructure more disaster resilient, there will be additional cost. Some of the panelists already touched upon that. I think that one thing we need to do probably, and as a community of financial institutions, I think I see the need to revise methodology of the project appraisal. We need to see that in the calculation of benefits, we also put resilience against the disasters is one of the major benefits. Otherwise, for the contractors, for the end users and others, there will be little incentive. They want to bear the additional cost for sort of a contingency and a risk in the future. To do that, I think that we would probably also need to make a coordinated efforts by the government, by the financiers, bankers, and also for the contractors. Last but not least, I think these days we are aware of the fact that the technology matters too. If we can really apply and promote low cost technology for the disaster resilience areas, I think that can benefit hugely. Also, I think that in addition to technology, we also need to promote and good practices globally, regionally, and also at the country levels. One example I remember when I worked in Bangladesh for the World Bank, and which I thought we all know as a country and frequently hit by disasters. when that we supported the infrastructure for the social sectors, like building schools, clinics, hospitals. We also try to do, particularly in the areas of disaster, frequently hit disaster areas, and build these facilities eventually to be used when disaster occur, like a cyclone, like a flood, so that these facilities can be used for the safety havens. Otherwise, I think that when that disaster comes all of a sudden, and the community is ill prepared for the people to go somewhere to save their lives. So I think that disaster resilience is increasingly important and subject to all of us. And also one thing we probably need to remind of ourselves, in the last decade, 90% of the deaths hit by the disasters are in developing countries. It's our responsibility to see that will not be repeated in the next decade. I think that all in our development community, government, NGOs, and others, this is our shared responsibility to make that as constantly a responsibility, but rather than to say when the major disaster occur, and then that reminds us of our responsibility. This should be our everyday effort. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Xian Zhu. You have indeed suggested that not only we should include the impact of disaster as an important parameter in all stages of project cycle, we should in fact revise the methodology of project appraisal, which should include in the items to be considered for estimating the benefit, the aspect of resilience. So this is a very, very important suggestion that I don't think so far in any of our cost benefit, whether it is economic, social, or even social cost benefit analysis, we include many qualitative aspects, but this resilience aspect so far has not been included, and this is a very, very important suggestion. About the developing new technology, also low cost technology, that is also very important, and also the point about enforcement and compliance. They are very, very important issues, of course, that will be a continuous process, how to incentivize development of new technology, how to ensure compliance, how to ensure capacity building, and so on. Thank you very much for your suggestions. Then our next speaker is Mr. Ahmed, Country Director for India at the World Bank.
Thank you very much, Chair. So as the oldest member of this panel, let's see if I can share a little bit of our experience. You know, growing up in Bangladesh as a young boy, every year we would gather to go knock on doors to raise funds because yet another flood had hit. This was just part of who we were growing up. But we've come a long way from looking at disasters as a response of emergency and addressing famine and disaster, to now thinking about disaster management as part of development, and to really look at how we can build resilience so we can prevent this. It's been a huge shift, a tectonic shift, I would say, in the way development has begun to take on the whole issue of disaster management and resilience. And I think that all of you who belong to this profession that has really focused on the issue of disaster management, to you we owe the thanks for introducing the word resilience in the development language. And I think that the use of the word resilience now is not only for disasters, but it is now looking at development in very, very different ways. In political terms, in economic terms, in social terms. So today, when we look at the word resilience and ask ourselves, how can we make infrastructure more resilient? I asked myself, what would I advise if I were talking to the Minister of Finance or the Minister of Disaster Management in my country, in Bangladesh? What would I advise the minister? I think the first thing I would say is we are in Asia and in Africa at a very historic moment. And that historic moment is that the nature of our economy is changing. We're becoming urbanized. And the urbanization process is going to lead to completely new urban structures and urban systems emerging. Now is the moment to address the whole issue of dealing with risk in the arrival of, and this was mentioned before, arrival of new infrastructure. So in my opinion, if we truly believe in trying to create resilient infrastructure, we ought to put a lot of emphasis in creating creditworthy and well-governed cities. Because resilient cities cannot be created without creating creditworthy and well-governed cities. And I think the Honorable Prime Minister of India, in launching Smart Cities Initiative in Amrut, has launched clearly one of the most powerful programs in which resilience can be dealt with, because it gets embedded in the whole notion of how you engage in creating creditworthy, well-governed cities. And I think this is a very, very important point in terms of the historic moment, especially for South Asia and Africa, the two regions that are urbanizing. Africa is urbanizing at speed, and South Asia is urbanizing in terms of scale. I think the second point that I would share with my minister would be the importance of intergovernmental coordination. It is impossible to deal with disasters or building resilience unless the center, state, and the local are coordinated in their mechanisms. You look at the United States and you look at New Orleans and Katrina. One of the lessons learned was FEMA, the central agency, well locked in with the state and well locked in with the mayors at the city level in terms of addressing the disaster that hit New Orleans. And I think the United States would be the first one to say that coordination was not effective. I think if I look at Bangladesh, where we have municipal mayors, the mayor's response is really going to be driven a lot by what kind of incentives emerge from the center. And I think that relationship becomes extremely important in building resilience. I think the third area of advice I would give is invest in insurance. And invest in insurance has many, many elements to it. And again, members of this panel have raised some of them. One is invest in building stronger safety nets. And I think South Asia has begun to really push the whole issue of unique identities. And in fact, that's another historic issue, is today we know by name and by address many of those who are poor. This is not something that was there a decade or 2 decades ago. If we can identify their address and we can identify who they are, we should be able to create a safety net. And that's exactly a revolution that is ongoing across the world, is creation of that safety net, which is very important to give people their resilience. Second is financial inclusion. I think that from Sebi's point of view and others, the creation of financial inclusion is a mechanism of creating that kind of insurance for individuals. And the third would be literally creating what I would call political risk insurance. Capital markets is where all the money is. At the end of the day, fiscal resources of government is not enough to deal with the need for infrastructure and resilient infrastructure. We've got to create a linkage between capital markets and the fiscal system. And here we know that a lot of it is going to be dealing with risk. And I think the multilateral institutions increasingly will need to balance their approach to lending with introducing risk insurance in order to ensure leveraging of capital markets. And I think that the final point, the two final points that I would put in my basket of advice, one is the whole issue of how do we leverage the network of learning institutions, universities and think tanks that are constantly learning the new world of resilience. How do we sponsor them? How do we support them? Because this is a network that can really be used to support government policies in building the type of institutions that will finance and build the resilient infrastructure. And then the final point is technology. Technology has always been and always will be the game changer. For multilateral institutions, the question is not how we help countries or institutions create new technology. I think our challenge, because markets and private sector will do that effectively, I think our challenge is how do we ensure access to technology that's emerging, that is not captured by any one player. And I don't think we've spent enough time understanding what kind of interventions lead to the type of, if you will, equitable access to technology so that all can benefit. From our perspective of 70 years in the world of infrastructure, the World Bank has been one of the largest financiers of infrastructure in the public sector. And we started off building infrastructure from the time of reconstruction of Europe from a very much an engineering perspective. Over time, that moved into understanding that to build cost-effective infrastructure and sustain them required institutions and governance. And that entered into our if you will, development of our programs. We then went one step further when we realized that institutions and governance was not enough, but the social and environment aspect had to be brought into doing infrastructure. And that too was introduced in terms of the way we do projects. Today, our projects deal now with a new area, which is climate resilience. We, in fact, in the World Bank, are tracking how much of our projects finance climate resilience, and that has already been embedded in the DNA of the way we do projects. Our president is committed by year 2020, if I'm not wrong, that we would be financing about $29 billion a year in climate resilience financing in terms of all our financing. So, as a 70-year-old agency, we feel we're entering a new and young world of climate resilience, and it has given us a very different perspective in the way we function. And I look forward to the collaboration with all our colleagues here. I'm not a great fan of creating national agencies or central agencies, but I'm a great fan of tapping into each other's experience and leveraging the capacity to ensure that we collectively can learn from each other and deliver. And that is a commitment, certainly, that the World Bank will continue to make. We have, in the last 5 years, put in $50 billion across 130 countries in climate-related activities, and over the past 5 years, invested over $5 billion annually in risk management. I hope that these kind of resources will actually enable us to leverage far more the capital markets, because that's the untapped resource that's still out there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ahmed. Important points highlighted include the process of urbanization, which will be affecting South Asia, Africa, and other areas. You have also mentioned what sort of measures the government should take, your policy advice. And all these will, not only urbanization, but much of this new infrastructure which will come during the next few years will pose many challenges. You have suggested intergovernmental coordination, of course, investing in insurance, financial inclusion, and finally political risk insurance. Some of these points were made by the Prime Minister of India also this morning in the inaugural session, including the networking of various knowledge institutions and use of technology. And finally, you have suggested collaborative approach, and as you mentioned that it may not be in the form of creating a new institution, but leveraging with the existing institutions' knowledge. All these aspects can be further refined in the days to come. These are very, very useful inputs for our recommendations. Thank you very much. Finally, I request Mr. Robert Glasser to make his presentation. He will provide the UN perspective and also the overall perspective, and I hope that he will also keep in view the suggestions made by other speakers before him.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'll try to focus on things that I think others haven't said to maybe fill in a few blanks. First, in terms of the context, this larger context, we have made much progress, countries, have made much progress in reducing loss of life in disasters. There are still places where that's not the case, but for the most part, we're making enormous progress. We are not making progress in terms of economic losses. They are going up dramatically. And as one of our earlier speakers pointed out, there is a disproportionate impact on developing countries, less developed countries. Most of the economic losses are in wealthy countries, but if you look at the relative impact of losses for less low-income countries, it averages to equate to something like the average annual loss of disasters equates to something like over 20% of annual investment in the social expenditure. In some countries, it's 50%, 60%. So it's a huge relative impact, a disproportionate impact on low-income countries. So we know the costs are large each year, 300 billion a year going, but we don't actually know the actual figure because there are huge gaps in the data, but certainly 300 billion going up to 400 billion. We also know that there are just inconceivably large numbers associated with future projected investments in infrastructure. OECD has said 50 trillion. We've heard numbers at this meeting that are just astronomically large. 1 billion new homes to be built in the next few decades. I think one of the points I wanted to highlight is how do you embed risk in national budgeting and processes, because this is one of the big features of Sendai, is this move from managing disasters to managing risks. And fundamentally that means embedding risk in core economic planning and choices. If you look at climate change adaptation planning, I've seen this in many countries now, you have a climate change adaptation strategy which is managed by an environment ministry, which is a relatively weak ministry. You have a disaster risk reduction strategy which is coordinated by the disaster management agencies, and you have economic planning generally coordinated by finance ministries. These three things really need to come together. You need to have disaster risk, climate risk, because if you look at these escalating costs, economic costs, there are two reasons. One is a very good reason, economic growth and investment in new infrastructure is creating additional vulnerable infrastructure. A second is climate change, and increasingly climate change is going to exacerbate that. So economic growth is a good thing, but the fact that the losses are increasing suggests that this infrastructure, these investments, are not risk-informed. How do you then have a discussion with the finance ministry about this? The first thing you need is good disaster loss data. You need to be able to quantify what disasters have cost. The second thing you need is a risk profile, risk projection, which because the past is no longer a reliable future predictor of the future as a result of climate change. So you have a projection of the future. And with these two pieces of information, then that's a dollar figure that can be brought to the table with finance ministries to talk about embedding risk in budget processes. It seems to me there are really three areas that are relevant with respect to infrastructure. The first is what this risk information says about investments in new infrastructure. And that is both investments that are specifically addressing disaster risk. An example would be building a seawall as a barrier. But a subset of that is all new infrastructure investment should be risk-proofed or tested against this. And there are a whole variety of ways that can happen, of course. You have the RFPs for infrastructure investments that require that. You have choices among options. But, you know, it is absolutely not the case that resilient infrastructure investments need to be more expensive. They can be, they often are, but it's not the rule necessarily. You can have two choices, one that is building a hospital in a flood zone and one that isn't, and they may actually be the same cost. Without understanding the risk, you're building a hospital in a flood zone. So it depends, of course. And then the third area is existing stock of infrastructure. Before coming here, I had a meeting in Quito. My last meeting in Quito was with the mayor of Ecuador. He had just received a study from his engineers that said in the next major earthquake, not extremely large, just major earthquake, they anticipate that 60% of the buildings will collapse in Quito. So there's a huge challenge to address disaster risk with the existing stock of infrastructure. There is a huge challenge to ensure that sensible investments are made directly to address disaster risk. And there's a huge challenge to make sure that all new investments take risk into account. I wanted to highlight just two other quick things. First, that this idea of the $50 trillion in new investment, something like 70% of that is private sector investment. And I think we haven't actually mentioned the private sector enough in this discussion. So clearly government has infrastructure assets across the country, and government has a fundamental role in setting, as does Parliament in the same sense, in setting the zoning and the building codes, and actually with the enforcement as well. But the private sector has to play a fundamental role in this, both in terms of securing its own supply chain, how it works with its workforce in areas that are potentially at risk or exposed to hazards, and certainly in the recovery phase. And the community level, of course, is fundamental because that's where most of the assets are, homes and the like. The final thing I wanted to mention is that there are some very innovative global level initiatives around this infrastructure that are extremely interesting. One, there's an initiative with some of the largest insurance firms in the world to talk about sharing risk data, to talk about insurance products to reach poorer communities, more marginalized communities, to talk about risk pooling and sovereign risk funds and so on that are extremely relevant to the infrastructure discussion. There are also discussions about using the investment markets to move resilience forward, including designing portfolios of resilient infrastructure to attract investment so that global investment financing flows towards resilient infrastructure and away from infrastructure that isn't resilient as we define those standards. So those are just a few observations. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Glasser. Some of the important aspects like innovative global practices and designing portfolios, basically the financing mechanism, and of course you talked about the existing infrastructure and resilient infrastructure and so on. We don't have much time actually. I'm told that all of you have another session also after this. But we can spend about 5 minutes if there are some important observations or questions. So please be very, very brief, just bullet point of a question, and if you have any observation, then of course we'll see which panelists can respond. There are two hands here, middle, third row and then the fourth row. I'll come. Please introduce
Thank you, Chair. You are sitting with very important person related to your session. All of you said about infrastructure should be disaster resilient, but I would like to request you to say few things for infrastructure for disaster risk reduction, like embankment, seawall. So this type of infrastructure should be built especially in coastal area of Bangladesh for river erosion, for sea erosion. People are in risks of displacement and the pressure to big cities. So this type of infrastructure should be funded, and they need much fund for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Next one, next row.
Good evening. My name is Diganta Chaudhary, and I am a student of Sustainability Management from Xavier School of Sustainability, Xavier University, Bhubaneswar. What I want to give is a general comment on this topic. That is, in the road to build risk-resilient infrastructure for a sustainable world, there is something that is needed more than funds and policies. It is the human resource working in that field, in that particular industry. It is the people of the organization who formulate the ideas and frameworks and work together to properly implement them. I believe it is essential for the private and the public sector to focus in the quality of manpower than just focus on the funds. For example, me being a student of sustainability management, am receiving formal education based on the field of sustainability, which comprises of almost everything ranging from human development, disaster risk reduction, renewable energy, green marketing, green infrastructure, etc. We can provide cost-efficient solutions, plans, designs, and implement them to connect business and society, keeping the 3 Ps of sustainability in mind, that is, people, profit, people, planet, and profit. Thank you.
Thank you. This side, yeah.
I'm Kishore Kumar from Central Road Research Institute, New Delhi. And my question is, in fact, I'll spend 1 minute to explain what I really want to know. Is that, as Mr. Pandian has said, road infrastructure, everybody talks about the figures, as how many died and so on and so forth. But nobody talks about the resilience. Resilient infrastructure, road infrastructure. Now, when we talk about resilient road infrastructure, for example, we take the example of India, our country. We have very good roads constructed in hilly areas, particularly in Himalayas. But even the best constructed road, with the best of the technologies they have constructed, they are suffering continuously from the landslide disaster. What is the reason? And not only in India, but all the countries, particularly Asian countries, particularly those are in hilly areas, are suffer from such kind of disaster. More than 90% of landslide are on the highways. Now, I would like to focus on that, but so far we are stressing on maintenance the highways and roads only. But roads and highways are constructed on the hills, on the slopes. And we are not at all worried about the maintenance of the slopes.
Please, we don't have time.
So my request is
I have been asked by the organizers to close the session because some other session is there.
So last point, my request is that all the banks who are funding the infrastructure, particularly road infrastructure, as AIIB particularly, should have this in mind that slopes are to be maintained along with the maintenance of the infrastructure.
Only that here was, yes, that and this lady is at the middle. So
thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Good evening, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for giving me the floor. I'm Ali Ahmed Khan, Director General Bangladesh Fire and Rescue Service, who are the respondent of any sort of rescue operation. And you know, Bangladesh is a disaster prone because of the geographical location. And my question is to Mr. Jang and Mr. Ahmed, World Bank and ADB. And you know, Bangladesh has quite progressed well in managing disaster like flood and cyclone, and ADB as World Bank plays a very vital role.
Could you please come to the question?
Just my question is that, because there are a lot of vulnerable society, and in case of only the Dhaka is a very vulnerable cities, and there are a lot of critical or vulnerable infrastructures where the lot of, I think, vulnerable or the marginalized people are still staying there, and it is becoming very difficult to evacuate them. There are, I think, 300, 400 very risky buildings, and if the big earthquake happens, and they're going to face life.
So how to
So my
evacuate?
question is that in that regard, ADB or World Bank, they have any plan to support this sort of, I think, vulnerable citizen?
Okay, we
with
note the
infrastructure?
question. Yeah,
Thank
that,
you.
Yes.
Good evening. I'm Dr. Edmund Fernandez from Government of Karnataka DDMA. It's just an observation which I want to put to the august panelist, that kindly also, while you develop the risk resilient infrastructure, put public health on your agenda.
Okay, that noted. That's a
Thank
very
you.
good point. Yeah, this.
Thank you very much. I'm Kobita Bosch. I'm from Bangladesh. My questions to all the banks and also including the UN. When we talk about the retrofitting or investing on any infrastructure to make the infrastructure resilient from any disaster, so we think about general structure, general infrastructure, and my question is that how do you think and how you are doing the accessibility issues when you are investing? For example, so women's, older people's, person with disability, they have high level of challenges during disaster, and so they are most vulnerable, and most often they are forgotten to be rescued and to have a
this
good
is a good
shelter.
point.
So do you have that plan? If yes, how you are doing, or if not, how you have plan on? Thank you.
No, I think now now we have to close this session because we don't have time. Some other people will use this room. I would just conclude very briefly. I must thank all the panelists. I think they have made extremely valuable points. And also some of you who have raised extremely important issues like, for example, Bangladesh embankment and similar structures to mitigate the disaster risk. Then of course vulnerable buildings. Then health, it's certainly an important part of infrastructure. And of course, the women, children, and those who are more vulnerable. I think all these will be part of our social infrastructure. And when the detailed plans and detailed approaches, all these will certainly be incorporated. Now, coming to all the presentations and all that, we have noted down a number of points which have been raised. In fact, they run into about 30, 40 points. I was thinking of reading each one of them, but it won't be feasible given the constraint of time. But broadly, the speakers and from the points which all of you have raised, there are 4 or 5 very, very major aspects. First recommendation is that strengthening or developing regulations, norms and standards. There are world-class standards in some countries on some aspect of infrastructure, but many others may not have, or those who have also, it needs to be upgraded. This is a very important point which has come out, and that should also include standards and norms, the aspect of disabled people, women, vulnerable sections, health and social infrastructure and so on. Within that, of course, we need to have the issue of enforcement. And one very important point was raised by one of you is the quality of human resource. Any enforcement of building standard, we may have very good building standard, but unless we have the quality human resource, the quality engineers to design this, the structural engineers, and even if have designed properly, we need to have engineers, the site engineer, the implementation engineer who will be able to actually reflect that on the ground. So this is very important thing about design, technology and how we can exchange ideas. Second aspect, of course, it is a major aspect, and already I have mentioned capacity building for enforcing regulation. Because all of us know that urbanization and so many other issues are there, how to enforce there. And we have seen the quality of municipal engineers when they approve the building plan, whether they have capability to ensure that it conforms to the standards. So these are some of the issues. So capacity building is one of the important, the detailed points also we have noted coming from the panelists' presentations. Then third aspect, risk assessment of new infrastructure. Risk assessment in the sense that whether it is resilient to disaster and also whether it will add to new disaster. These aspects, and an important suggestion which was made that in our project appraisal, we must include resilience as a benefit or lack of resilience as a cost. So that can also, we need to modify our methodology for project appraisal. Then promoting use of science and technology and innovation, the best practices. So all these are very important aspects. Then of course we must learn from each other. And finally, how to go about it. We have discussed all these are desirable, there is no dispute. But we can't implement all these overnight. We can't exchange ideas from each other. We can't learn best practices to make it, to continue it further, to look at the way forward, to have a sustainable effort in implementing all these things. What was suggested by the esteemed panelist was that we must have some mechanism, some coalition, some collaborative arrangement. And this was also highlighted by the Prime Minister of India this morning. He also mentioned about a center or a coalition or similar mechanism, and which has been wholeheartedly supported by almost all the panelists. That of course will need lot of work to be done. So we, that is also the major recommendation of this session, that we must have a mechanism how to continue these collaborative efforts in a more effective manner in the years to come. And that of course we will work out how to design the mechanism, keeping in view the Prime Minister's suggestion this morning and all the suggestions here. And once that effort continues, when the mechanism is in place, all these things about strengthening regulation, developing new standards or capacity building or the risk assessment and project appraisal parameters and so on will be also incorporated, and also that also will help us in enforcing all those aspects in a much more effective way. Finally, I thank all the panelists. I thank all of you for your very patient hearing and also making very, very important suggestions. And we now conclude the session. It has been extremely fruitful, useful, and we have crystallized our ideas in a and prepared a concrete action plan and a roadmap. Thank you.